The death penalty is one of the most controversial aspects of the justice system, and while many imagine death row inmates as older individuals who have spent decades awaiting execution, some are shockingly young. Today we take a deep dive into the youngest people currently on death row, their crimes, sentencing, and what lies ahead for them. Stay tuned as we uncover their chilling stories. Krista Pike, State, Tennessee, age at crime 18.
The only woman on Tennessee's death row is asking the courts to reconsider her death sentence. Krista Pike was convicted in 1996. She and two other people tortured and killed 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer. 10 News reporter Ryan Connors explains what the move means for the family of the victim and what happens next.
Krista Gale. Pike was an 18-year-old student at the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee, when she committed one of the most brutal murders in modern U.S. history. On January 12, 1995, Pike, along with two accomplices, Tatterall Shipp, 17, and Shadala Peterson, 18, lured 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer to an isolated location on the University of Tennessee agricultural campus under the pretense of resolving a personal dispute. According to prosecutors, Pike was jealous of Slemmer, believing she was trying to pursue Shipp, with whom Pike had been romantically involved. What started as a confrontation quickly turned into a horrific act of sadistic torture. Over the course of 13 to 40 minutes, Pike and Shipp brutally beat and slashed Slemmer with a box cutter and a meat cleaver. They carved a pentagram into her chest and ultimately smashed her skull with a chunk of asphalt. After the murder, Pike kept a piece of Slemmer's skull as a trophy and even bragged about the killing to fellow students. The gruesome nature of the crime and Pike's apparent lack of remorse shocked investigators and the public alike. During her trial, Pike showed little emotion as evidence, including her confessions and forensic findings were presented. In 1996, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, making her the youngest woman in the United States to receive the death penalty in modern times. Her accomplice, Tatterall Shipp, was sentenced to life in prison, while Shadala Peterson, who played a lesser role, received probation for her cooperation. Pike remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Over the years, she has made multiple attempts to appeal her sentence, but all have been denied. In 2001, she attacked a fellow inmate, nearly killing her by strangulation with a shoelace. This violent incident reinforced arguments for keeping her on death row. Despite her attorney's efforts to argue that her young age and difficult upbringing should be mitigating factors, Tennessee courts have upheld her death sentence. As of 2025, Krista Pike remains incarcerated at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville, awaiting execution. Austin Myers, State, Ohio, age at crime 18.
A 19-year-old from Warren County, now the youngest person on death row in Ohio.
The idea that he has no worth or value as a human being, so better off euthanized.
For the brutal murder of a friend.
We have memories, but we will have no more with our son because of the choices that you made, Austin.
On January 28, 2014, Austin Myers and his accomplice, Timothy Mosley, planned to rob and murder Justin Back, a former high school classmate, at his home in Waynesville, Ohio. Their initial plan was to break into Back's house while he was away and steal a safe containing money and valuables. However, when they arrived, they found Back at home, which led to a deadly escalation. Instead of abandoning their plan, Myers and Mosley decided to kill Back to eliminate any witnesses. They first attempted to strangle him with a chokehold, but when that failed, Mosley stabbed Back multiple times while Myers helped restrain him. After the murder, they wrapped Back's body in a blanket and transported it to a remote wooded area, where they dumped it and tried to burn it to destroy evidence. Authorities quickly identified Myers and Mosley as suspects. Mosley cooperated with investigators, providing crucial details that implicated both of them. As a result, he received a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In contrast, Myers, who was considered the mastermind behind the crime, showed no remorse during the trial. In 2014, Austin Myers was sentenced to death, making him the youngest person on Ohio's death row at the time. His appeals have been unsuccessful, and he remains incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, awaiting execution. Austin Myers remains alive on death row. His execution date has not been scheduled. Marco Antonio Perez, the murder of Officer Sean Tudor, State, Alabama. Age at crime 19. On January 20, 2019, Marco Antonio Perez, a 19-year-old fugitive with an extensive criminal history, fatally shot Mobile police officer Sean Tudor in Alabama. At the time of the shooting, Perez was wanted on multiple charges, including probation violations and theft. Officers had tracked him to an apartment complex where they attempted to take him into custody. During the arrest attempt, Perez ambushed Officer Tudor, shooting him at close range. Despite immediate efforts to save Tudor's life, he succumbed to his injuries at the scene. The killing shocked the Mobile community and law enforcement nationwide, as Tudor was a decorated officer known for his dedication to public service. Following his arrest, prosecutors argued that the murder was premeditated, highlighting Perez's history of violent offenses and disregard for law enforcement. His defense team attempted to argue mitigating factors related to his age, but the jury ultimately found him guilty of capital murder. In 2022, Marco Antonio Perez was sentenced to death for the premeditated killing of Officer Tudor. The judge upheld the jury's recommendation for the death penalty, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crime. Perez remains on death row in Alabama, awaiting execution. Luigi Mangione, State, New York. Age at crime, 26.
Luigi Mangione, an alleged killer and subject of public fascination after days on the run, charged with the New York City murder of a healthcare insurance CEO.
In December 2024, Luigi Mangione, then 26, was charged with the premeditated murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in New York City. The incident occurred on December 4, 2024, when Thompson was fatally shot outside the New York Hilton Midtown Hotel. Mangione was apprehended on December 9, 2024, at a McDonald's restaurant in Altoona, Pennsylvania. At the time of his arrest, authorities discovered a 3D printed firearm and suppressor, a fake New Jersey driver's license, and a handwritten document criticizing the American healthcare system. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced on April 1, 2025, that federal prosecutors would seek the death penalty against Mangione, describing the act as a premeditated, cold-blooded assassination. This decision aligns with President Trump's agenda to combat violent crime. Mangione faces both federal and state charges. The federal charges include murder through the use of a firearm, which carries the possibility of the death penalty. State charges in New York include murder as an act of terrorism and weapons offenses, carrying a maximum punishment of life in prison. Mangione has pleaded not guilty to the state charges and has yet to enter a plea for the federal charges. His defense attorney, Karen Friedman Agnifilo, has criticized the decision to seek the death penalty, arguing that the government is defending a broken, immoral, and murderous healthcare industry. As of April 2025, Mangione remains in federal custody awaiting trial. The case has garnered significant public attention, with debates surrounding the death penalty, the healthcare system, and political motivations. Paula Cooper, State, Indiana. Age at crime 15. Paula Cooper was only 15 years old when she committed a crime that shocked the nation. On May 14, 1985, Cooper and 3 other teenage girls planned to rob 78-year-old Ruth Pelk, a Bible teacher in Gary, Indiana. Cooper, along with her accomplices Denise Thomas 14, Karen Corder 16, and April Beverly 15, went to Pelka's home under the pretense of wanting to study the Bible with her. Once inside, the girls attacked Pelka, with Cooper taking the lead. She struck the elderly woman repeatedly and then brutally stabbed her 33 times in the chest and neck with a butcher knife. After murdering Pelke, the group stole a total of $10 and Pelke's car before fleeing the scene. The crime was particularly horrifying due to its extreme violence and the young ages of the perpetrators. Cooper was arrested shortly after and quickly confessed to the crime. She was tried as an adult, and in 1986, despite her young age, she was sentenced to death. Her sentencing made her the youngest person on death row in the United States at the time. The case gained national and international attention, sparking debates about the morality of sentencing juveniles to death. High-profile figures, including Pope John Paul II, pleaded for clemency on her behalf. During her time in prison, Cooper pursued education and rehabilitation programs, earning a degree and advocating for prison reform. After serving 27 years, she was released on June 17, 2013, at the age of 43. However, just 2 years later, in May 2015, Cooper was found dead in an apparent suicide in Indianapolis. Henry McCollum, State, North Carolina. Age at crime, 19. Henry McCollum was 19 years old when he and his half-brother Leon Brown were accused of the brutal rape and murder of 11-year-old Sabrina Buey in Red Springs, North Carolina, in 1983. The young girl had been found suffocated, her body partially clothed, and cigarette butts were discovered near the crime scene. The crime was horrific, and the community was eager for justice. McCollum and Brown, both intellectually disabled, were interrogated for hours by police without attorneys present. Eventually, McCollum signed a confession that was allegedly coerced, and Brown later followed. Their confessions contained inconsistencies, but prosecutors used them as the key evidence in their convictions. In 1984, McCollum was sentenced to death, while Brown, who was only 16 at the time, was given life in prison. Brown's sentence later changed to death, making him the youngest person on North Carolina's death row at the time. For years, the two men maintained their innocence, but their appeals were repeatedly denied. However, in 2014, nearly 30 years after their conviction, the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission reviewed their case. DNA evidence from a cigarette butt found at the crime scene was tested and did not match either McCollum or Brown. Instead, it was linked to Roscoe Artis, a convicted and murderer who lived near the crime scene at the time. Based on the new DNA findings, McCollum and Brown were exonerated and released on September 2, 2014. After spending decades behind bars for a crime they did not commit, McCollum had become North Carolina's longest-serving death row inmate before his exoneration. In 2015, both men received full pardons from the governor. Later, they sued the state and were awarded $75 million in damages, the largest wrongful conviction settlement in U.S. history. Sean Sellers, State, Oklahoma. Age at crime, 16. Sean Sellers had a troubled upbringing marked by a history of abuse, mental health issues, and a deepening fascination with Satanism. As a teenager, Sellers became involved in the occult, a factor he later claimed played a role in the murders. On the night of the first crime, Sellers, armed with a gun, entered the convenience store where Bellafato worked. After robbing the store, he shot Bellafato in the back, killing him in cold blood. After committing this murder, Sellers went on to kill his mother and stepfather a few months later. According to Sellers, he killed his mother and stepfather while they were asleep in bed. He later explained that he believed he was under the influence of Satanism at the time of the killings, describing his actions as being driven by voices he heard in his head. Sellers was arrested shortly after the murder of his parents. At trial, his defense team argued that his age, mental health, and his involvement in Satanism should be considered as mitigating factors. Sellers' mental state was a focal point of the trial, as psychiatrists testified that he suffered from depression, antisocial behavior, and likely had a dissociative disorder. Despite appeals based on his young age, 16 at the time of the murders and mental health, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. He was the first person executed in the United States for a crime committed at 16 since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Sellers' execution was particularly controversial because of his age and the mental health factors in his case. Before his execution, Sellers underwent a significant personal transformation. He converted to Christianity while on death row, and some religious groups argued that his change in faith demonstrated his rehabilitation. Still, his execution went ahead as scheduled. Sellers' final words were a mixture of remorse and faith. "I just want to say I'm sorry for everything I did, and I hope my family will forgive me. I love you all, and I know God will take care of you." His final statement was brief, but it reflected the transformation he had gone through while on death row. Sellers requested a final meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and a Coca-Cola, though it was reported that he didn't finish it. Sellers was pronounced dead at 6:03 p.m. on February 4, 1999, after being executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. George Stinney Jr., State, South Carolina. Age at crime, 14. George Stinney Jr. was arrested in 1944 after being accused of the brutal murders of two young white girls, Betty June Della and Mary Emma Thames, in the small town of Alcolu, South Carolina. The case against him was largely based on a coerced confession, and he was convicted by an all-white jury in a trial that lasted only a few hours. There was little to no evidence linking him to the crime, and his defense attorney was appointed just moments before the trial began, leaving no time to prepare an adequate defense. At the time of his execution, Stinney was only 14 years old, making him one of the youngest individuals ever sentenced to death in the United States. Stinney was executed by electric chair on June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest. The execution took place despite widespread doubts about his guilt, and there were numerous appeals for clemency based on his age and the lack of solid evidence. At that time, South Carolina had not yet established a minimum age for the death penalty, allowing juveniles as young as 14 to be sentenced to death. In 2014, Stinney's case was reopened after defense attorneys filed a petition arguing that the trial had been unfair and that the confession had likely been coerced. Following a thorough review of the case and the discovery of new evidence that suggested Stinney's innocence, a South Carolina judge overturned his conviction. The judge ruled that Stinney's constitutional rights had been violated and his conviction was vacated posthumously. Stinney did not have the opportunity to make a final statement as he was executed swiftly and unjustly. He had no final meal as he was executed without being given that chance. Stinney was executed by electric chair on June 16, 1944, at 7:30 p.m. and was pronounced dead shortly after the execution. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, State, Massachusetts, age at crime 19. On April 15, 2013, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his older brother Tamerlan Tsarnaev carried out a terrorist attack during the Boston Marathon by planting 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line. The explosions killed 3 people, 8-year-old Martin Richard, 23-year-old Lingzi Liu, and 29-year-old Crystal Campbell, and injured over 260 others, many of whom suffered life-altering injuries such as amputations. Following the attack, the Tsarnaev brothers attempted to evade law enforcement, leading to a violent confrontation with police. During the ensuing manhunt, they murdered MIT police officer Sean Collier in an attempt to steal his service weapon. Later, they engaged in a firefight with law enforcement in Watertown, Massachusetts, where Tamerlan was killed after being shot multiple times and run over by Dzhokhar as he tried to escape. Dzhokhar was eventually discovered hiding in a boat in a residential backyard. Wounded and bleeding, he was arrested and taken into federal custody. In 2015, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was convicted on 30 federal charges, including use of a weapon of mass destruction, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. The jury sentenced him to death, and he was sent to ADX Florence, a supermax federal prison in Colorado, where he remains on death row. In 2020, a federal appeals court overturned his death sentence, arguing that the trial judge had not properly screened jurors for bias. However, in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated his death sentence. His legal team continues to pursue appeals, arguing that his older brother was the mastermind of the attack and that Dzhokhar acted under his influence. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev remains alive on federal death row. His execution date has not been scheduled. Raghunandan Yandamuri, State, Pennsylvania, age at crime 26. Raghunandan Yandamuri, an Indian national living in Pennsylvania, was just 26 when he was convicted of a horrifying double murder in 2012. Yandamuri, who was deeply in debt due to gambling, devised a plan to extort $50,000 from a family he knew by kidnapping their 10-month-old baby, Sanvi Vena. However, when he attempted to carry out his plan, he ended up killing the baby's grandmother, 61-year-old Satyavati Vena, during a struggle. He then kidnapped the infant, but instead of following through with his extortion scheme, he killed her by suffocating her with a handkerchief and leaving her in a suitcase in a nearby apartment complex. The crime shocked the local Indian American community in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Yandamuri was quickly identified as a suspect due to a ransom note he had left behind, which was linked to him through handwriting analysis. During police questioning, he initially confessed on video, but later claimed that his confession was coerced and that he was innocent. Yandamori was tried in 2014, and despite his attempts to act as his own lawyer, he was found guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and burglary. The jury sentenced him to death, making him the first Indian national to receive a death sentence in the United States. He remains on Pennsylvania's death row at the State Correctional Institution, Phoenix. However, due to Pennsylvania's moratorium on executions, his death sentence is unlikely to be carried out anytime soon. Scott Hornoff. State, Rhode Island. Age at crime, 19. Scott Hornoff was convicted in 1986 for the murder of a police officer, which occurred in Rhode Island. At the age of 19, Hornoff was sentenced to death for the crime, despite claims of a coerced confession and significant issues with the handling of evidence. His case became highly controversial as new evidence, including the discovery of his innocence, emerged over time. In the 1990s, it was revealed that Hornoff had been wrongfully convicted, leading to the overturning of his conviction and his eventual release from prison. Hornoff's case stands as a poignant example of the potential for errors in the justice system, particularly in cases involving young defendants. The wrongful conviction of Hornoff underscores the importance of ensuring that all legal processes are fair and just, especially in cases where the stakes are as high as the death penalty. His release highlighted the significant flaws in his trial, with many critics arguing that his age, the circumstances surrounding his confession, and the mishandling of evidence contributed to the failure of justice. Hornoff was never executed and ultimately regained his freedom after spending years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Kevin Johnson, State, Missouri.
Ambushed, repeatedly shot and killed her husband, the father of her 3 kids, as he sat in his patrol car. The fallen police sergeant's widow and 2 loved ones witnessed the execution of 37-year-old Kevin Johnson.
Age at sentencing, 19. Kevin Johnson was sentenced to death in Missouri for the 2005 murder of Kirkwood Police Sergeant William McEntee. At just 19 years old, Johnson ambushed McEntee and shot him multiple times in retaliation for his 12-year-old brother's death earlier that day. Johnson believed that the police, including McEntee, had failed to assist his brother, Joseph "Bomb Bomb" Long, who suffered a seizure and died. That evening, while McEntee was responding to a fireworks complaint in the neighborhood, Johnson confronted him, opening fire. Even after McEntee fell to the ground, Johnson returned and shot him again, ensuring his death. Johnson was convicted of first-degree murder in 2007, and prosecutors successfully argued that his actions were deliberate and premeditated. His defense team, however, contended that he acted out of grief and emotional distress, blaming the police for his brother's death. Despite efforts to seek a lesser sentence, Johnson was sentenced to death, making him one of Missouri's youngest individuals on death row. His case sparked national debates over the juvenile death penalty and racial bias in capital punishment. His supporters argued that the prosecutor in his case disproportionately sought the death penalty against black defendants, and his attorneys pointed to new Supreme Court rulings that placed restrictions on executing juveniles and those with intellectual disabilities. However, courts consistently denied Johnson's appeals, and Missouri Governor Mike Parson refused to grant clemency, despite calls from legal experts and activists. Johnson was executed by lethal injection on November 29, 2022 at 7:40 p.m. CST. He did not request a special last meal and instead opted for the standard prison meal. In his final words, Johnson expressed remorse for his actions, apologized to McEntee's family, and thanked his own family for their love and support. His execution was Missouri's second in 2022 and remains a significant case in discussions surrounding young offenders and the death penalty. Michael Bargo, State, Florida. Age at crime, 18. Michael Bargo was involved in one of the most chilling and brutal murders in Florida's history. In 2011, at the age of 18, Bargo orchestrated the murder of 15-year-old Seth Jackson in Marion County, Florida. The crime was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but the result of personal conflicts and disputes between Bargo and Jackson. Bargo, along with a group of accomplices, including his ex-girlfriend, lured Jackson to a residence with the promise of reconciliation. However, upon Jackson's arrival, he was brutally attacked, The group beat Jackson, shot him multiple times, and then disposed of his body by burning it in a fire pit. The horrific nature of the crime shocked the community and garnered widespread media attention. Bargo was identified as the mastermind behind the entire plot, and his actions, as well as the level of cruelty involved, led to his conviction. In 2013, Michael Bargo was sentenced to death for the murder of Seth Jackson. The case was deeply troubling, especially given the fact that it involved several young individuals, which raised questions about the role of peer influence and mental state in such violent crimes. Despite appeals, Bargo's death sentence was reaffirmed in 2019, and he remains on death row in Florida. Dexter Johnson, State, North Carolina, age at crime 19. Dexter Johnson, at the age of 19, was involved in a violent robbery at a convenience store in North Carolina. During the robbery, Johnson shot and killed a store clerk. He was arrested shortly after the crime, and his involvement in the murder was established through witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Johnson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2010. The murder shocked the community due to its brutality and the young age of the perpetrator. Johnson's defense team argued that he was influenced by external pressures and had a troubled upbringing, which they believed played a role in his involvement in the crime. Despite these claims, the court found Johnson guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Dexter Johnson has not been executed yet, and his legal team has been appealing the death sentence. He remains on death row in North Carolina. These individuals are among the youngest inmates awaiting execution in the United States. Their shocking crimes and controversial sentences continue to fuel the debate over capital punishment, especially when it comes to youthful offenders. If you found this deep dive intriguing, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime insights.